So I want to welcome Kelly Giles to the show. You're the author of Killing Justice, a gripping memoir about your wrongful arrest as a respected immigration lawyer, the betrayal of a close friend, and how 10 months behind bars sparked your path to healing from PTSD and rediscovering your voice as a poet and storyteller. With your Juris Doctor from Pepperdine and decades practicing law, you've turned profound injustice into a beacon of hope. Today, we're honored to dive into that transformation with you. How are you doing today?
Doing all right. Thanks for asking.
Definitely. What specific evidence linked you unknowingly to the criminal enterprise run by your friend of 20 years? And how did the prosecution's overreach pressure you toward a guilty plea despite your innocence?
Sure. So, and I actually did not realize this, being an immigration lawyer, um, criminal law, just the potential for overreach and abuse. I initially thought, oh, maybe my case is unique. Maybe it's, not something that's actually systemic. But what I did right after I got out of prison, I gave a talk to some USC law students, and to prepare for that talk, I read a book called The Collapse of American Criminal Justice. And in that book, I learned by reading that book, I discovered that 100 years ago, the Supreme Court actually said in one of their decisions, if it would be too difficult for the government to to get a conviction, we will simply waive both motive and intent. And that's when conspiracy was born. And that's basically the law that was used in my case to intimidate me into taking a plea. I worked with Joseph, in the same office, and reviewed all the cases prior to filing. And because my name was on, it's called a G28, all those cases, they basically said, well, without my having signed off on these cases, he could not have committed his fraud. And that was the argument that was used as the basis for taking me down. However, two very key things in the plea, one of the reasons I fought for 3.5 years, they admitted A, that I didn't know that he was committing fraud, and B, that I'm the world's stupidest criminal. I didn't profit from his fraud. This guy and his wife made $1.2 million dollars without my knowledge. And for like 3 years, the prosecutor lied and pretended I made 300 grand. I refused to sign the plea till she admitted that I made 17,000 on the cases. They made 1.2 million. In other words, I was getting paid $200 a case, the same amount I got paid on all the clean cases. So there was no financial incentive, no motive. And like I say, no intent because I did not know he was committing this fraud.
How did the betrayal by Joseph manifest in your daily legal practice? And what warning signs did you miss as an experienced immigration lawyer?
Well, the first impact, I mean, I just had no idea who this guy was. I thought I did. But the first sort of revelation of who he was when we were both being released from prison together, from the pretrial detention phase, the first 8 days. And he actually said to me, I am fully responsible for what happened, and I will take full responsibility, which of course wasn't true. But then the last thing he said was, this is a great opportunity for you to find a new career. Now, he said this like as though we had no clients
Right.
because he had emotionally checked out, as soon as the shit hit the fan, or maybe even long before that. I have no idea. Maybe he was never emotionally checked in. But I was suddenly left holding the bag. I had an office to run. I had clients to try to save. I basically bankrupted myself, attempting to save those handful of clients to demonstrate that you got the wrong guy here. But in the end, none of that mattered. And so, how it impacted me was I lost everything. I lost I was disbarred, so I lost my law license. I lost my livelihood. And I lost, my reputation. And also my liberty. I was sentenced to 10 months in prison. And so this was all collateral damage from Joseph's fraud and betrayal.
I'm sorry you had to go through that. That's really, I enjoyed the book. And, I know like, that you have a fulfilling life like today. Like I met you at the film of independent events and, you're a very positive person. What ways did your 10-month imprisonment mirror the detention experiences of the immigrants you defended for decades?
Yeah, that was one of the biggest, sort of awakenings I think I had landing in prison was, and actually stripping away a lot of the illusions that I had prior to my arrest. The first and probably biggest one was the illusion of separation. Like, I believed that I was put on this planet to save my immigrant clients.
Right.
And for 2 decades, I had fought for them and they were abused. And it was, without realizing it, I was basically trying to save myself. And looking back again, well, my adoptive dad had suffered a traumatic brain injury my last year of law school. Well, that that grief was too great. I could not allow myself to feel that grief because 4 years earlier, when I'd had a near nervous breakdown in my first semester of law school, he had literally saved my life. He had loved me back to life. So to me, this was like God had died. Like the one person who had loved me at my worst when I had nothing to offer, when I couldn't even love myself, suddenly, with this traumatic brain injury, had the cognitive capacity of a 12-year-old. So looking back, I realized a year later, I become a lawyer, and my mom's voice is inside my head. Look how much I've sacrificed for you. So I felt, oh, if I can save my immigrant clients, I mean, I didn't consciously think this, but looking back, I realized I was so desperate to save my immigrant clients because I couldn't save myself. I could not. And so the parallel, like, I don't think I could have become any other type of lawyer but an immigration lawyer because immigrants and adoptees, our traumas mirror each other so closely. Um, Adoptees, were obviously not raised by our family of birth, just like immigrants are not living in their country of birth. And so we have a lot of trust issues, a lot of identity issues, a lot of, oh my God, how will I ever feel like I belong issues. And so when I landed in prison, suddenly I realized, oh my God, I thought I was here to save the least of these. I am the least of these. Like there's like no person that is below me in terms of our shared humanity. And I need saving. I need help just as much as any of my immigrant clients over the 2 decades had needed it.
That's deep. As a 23-year immigration lawyer, what dark realities of detention and deportation did your own prison ordeal reveal that you couldn't fully grasp from the outside?
Um, I believe the biggest one is the dehumanization. It's that you're not even a person anymore. You're a number, and it's just like you go from again this illusion of control, of relative power, relative entitlement, to oh my God, like I'm getting and yeah, well, just one example, I'm getting fed right now for 25 cents a day. So it's just like, okay, so how do I sort of like these two worlds to me just couldn't coexist. It's like, who was I just moments before my arrest, versus who am I suddenly now in federal prison. And so it was just like I get like just one example. In my old life as an immigration lawyer, I used to help a lot of women in abusive marriages, because they were immigrants and, there was their citizen spouse had control. And the whole time I was helping them, I had no idea that I was in an abusive relationship with Joseph. And so that's something that I began to understand when I was in prison is just how people's fears and unhealed wounds can be inflicted onto others. And so this had happened to my immigrant clients, and I had seen it sort of from the outside, but now all of a sudden I was seeing it from the inside, from actually experiencing what it's like to be abused, what it's like to be dehumanized, and how do you find your humanity in a place that's designed to destroy it?
How did U.S. immigration policies you once navigated contribute to the same governmental overwhelming power that derailed your life and career?
Well, it's this is what's so triggering for me, actually, the events that are happening all over this country right now with regard to immigrants, because I can really see how my individual trauma of getting arrested at LAX by a dozen heavily armed ICE agents is now playing itself out in major cities all over this country. And and again, it's like there's no separation. You know, those of us who think, people who think, oh well, I'll be fine because I'm not an immigrant, or I'll be fine because I'm the right skin color, or whatever their illusion of, oh, it could never happen to me. It's like, well, it did happen to me, and even though I'm an immigrant from Canada. And also I'm white. So these sorts of things don't happen to people who look like me. That's the lie that so many people believe and the fear that is behind so many of these policies. And it's not about my arrest was completely unnecessary. Um, I had had somebody call and let them know that I had a lawyer and the lawyer would bring me in the next morning. Just like 99% of the arrests taking place right now are completely unnecessary. These are not violent criminals. There's like less than 10%. And so just it's performance art. It's all about be afraid, be very afraid. And it's not meant just to intimidate immigrants, as we've seen. The one who cares for the least of these, anybody who dares to question this abuse is now deemed a terrorist, is now deemed an enemy of the state. And so we're basically seeing, what we criticize other countries for, like Russia, like Iran, and rightly so. They are repressive, authoritarian regimes. But, if we close our eyes to the potential for that in this country, that is an illusion that is sadly being shattered, on the daily right now.
Most definitely. Did your disbarment and felony convictions expose hypocrisies in how the legal system treats defenders versus detainees?
Oh, absolutely. And one probably the hypocrisy that where it was revealed most clearly was when I went in after being, basically coerced into signing off on this plea. When I was in court that day to change my plea, the other two defendants were Goldman Sachs and IBM. Now, prior to that day, I had known in my head that banks and corporations rule the world,
Right.
and the politicians just basically do what they're told.
Mhm.
But I had a front row seat that day as I watched the government lawyers basically say to both Goldman Sachs and IBM, "We're so sorry to have brought you here today. What can we do to make this all go away?" But then, when it came to me, who lacks money, who lacks power, all of a sudden I had to bite the bullet, plead to a lie in order to satisfy their need to take down a lawyer to look like, just like they're trying to look like, oh, we're being tough on, immigrants, to look like they're being tough on immigration lawyers, even though it's a lie. It's all just basically meant to keep the machinery going that basically feeds itself on fear. And there's two systems of justice. There's one for those banks and corporations that cannot, just like ICE and the federal government now, that have immunity, that can do whatever they want and not be held accountable. And then there's the rest of us who have to then suffer because of the way the system is designed.
How did adoptive trauma and religious abuse amplify your PTSD during imprisonment, and what role did they play in your pre-prison vulnerabilities?
Yeah, that was probably why well, yeah, definitely why it took me 10 years to write this book. Thank God for therapy. And thank God for sliding scale therapy, specifically in my case. I couldn't, after what happened to me, there's no way, just like I couldn't afford my lawyer and he came through He cared enough, telling me I was his first innocent client, to help me for a lot less than he would normally have charged. Same thing with the therapist that I found in a nonprofit. For 10 years, he helped me begin to process those traumas that I literally did not even know were there. In fact, it wasn't until I got arrested and then was fighting my case and wrote 3 volumes of poetry that all of the adoptive, the foster kid, the religious traumas slowly started bubbling to the surface. But it was more just, pouring my heart out on the page for those 3 volumes of poetry. There was nothing really coherent about it. There was nothing that could help me begin to make sense of it. So it was in therapy that he was able to help me understand, my therapist, how much I had idealized Joseph, and because I needed, like, as I refer to it in the book, the firms that I was with the first half of my career felt like foster firms. They all felt very temporary. But after Pop suffered his traumatic brain injury, I needed Pops 2.0. I needed a new adoptive father, and I thought Joseph was that. And so I got taken in by somebody who claimed to be a Christian and said all the right things. And I thought, oh, we're going to save immigrants together. But what I couldn't see was he wasn't Pops 2.0. He was actually my adoptive mom 2.0, who had her own history of abuse by her father, which made her unable to feel. And she passed that on to both my sister and I, as the only way to survive is not to feel. And so, to give you sort of the best sort of origin story for where my adoptive slash foster child trauma began, it began at the age of 11. Well, it began at birth, obviously, taken away from my birth mother, but where the first story I've been told that really helps me better understand my inability to feel was my mom, adoptive mom, used to tell me all the time that I cried the whole night when they took me from the foster home, but she would never end the story there. She would then go on to say, but you were smiling at everyone in church the very next Sunday. And that actually weaves in both. That weaves in both the adoptive and religious trauma, because the adoptive trauma was, oh my God, I can't feel, no matter how much, grief or, whatever these emotions are. Feelings are scary. Mom learned that at the hand, at her father abused her mother, and she was afraid of being subjected to similar abuse. So I absorbed that inability to feel. And then the messaging I got in church was basically the same messaging I got from my adoptive mom. Your will must be broken, young man. And then I go to church on Sunday, and the pastor would scream from the pulpit, your will must be broken. You must die to self. And so I basically came to believe that mom and God were the same. And because mom's God was this God of fear, I basically became, this God of fear became my false God. And then when I landed in prison, all of a sudden, now this is something that I haven't mentioned yet, but a year after my adoptive dad suffered his traumatic brain injury, and the same week I passed the bar, my birth mother found me. And that'll be my next memoir, writing about our relationship, because she, like Pops, was somebody who loved me better than I could love myself. But after she found me, she also helped me reunite with my foster mom, whose name was Grace. And the reason her name is so significant is that I had this huge, like, revelation when I landed in prison, which was my initials are KEDG. And I thought that stood, and I didn't realize this consciously, but my whole life up until that point, I had falsely believed that my initials stood for Kelly, entirely dependent upon goodness. That one day I'd be good enough for God, aka mom, to love. Landing in prison is like, oh my God, I will never be good enough. But what my initials really stand for are Kelly, entirely dependent upon grace, which is the human condition. I mean, it's not just limited to me, but it's like none of us is going to earn our way to heaven. Thank God we don't have to. It's all about grace, and that's been the journey. That's the journey that I take in this book, is exploring that journey from fear to love, that spiritual and psychological healing journey to sort of begin healing the wounds from being a foster kid, from being adopted, from having an adoptive mom who was abused herself, and trying to unlearn those negative that struggle with self-love that I have because of my mom's struggle with self-love. And then the struggle with self-love being compounded about messaging from the church I was raised in that I am just broken beyond repair, and therefore there must be something wrong with me, otherwise God or mom would love me.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful. What exact moment in prison shifted you from a silent soul to a resilient voice? And how did creativity emerge as your path to healing?
Well, I'd say the first thing that I did, and it's interesting because I sort of realized this in the halfway house after it was sort of on my way back out of prison, but they gave us a time management exercise, and it was actually a really helpful, most of the things they have you do in prison or the halfway house are just kind of meaningless, but this one actually had some value because the question was, what are the five things that most feed your soul? And so for me, reading and writing are definitely two of the top five. But then the second part was, how much of your day and or week do you spend doing the things that you say feed your soul the most? Well, prior to prison and even post prison, I struggle to do the things I say feed my soul the most. It's other things sort of push those out of the way. But the first thing, I did when I landed in prison is I just got as many books as I could out of the prison library. And so while I was there, those 8 months, I read 60 books. I read a book every 4 days. So that was my first sort of, way to process what I was going through, was to just to lose myself in amazing and mostly sci-fi. 40 of the 60 were science fiction. And so and then the second thing I did was to write. And just constantly, I was constantly either reading or writing. And those are the two things that do feed my soul the most. So that makes sense that I would, go to those things when I'm in a place where I have so little control. That gave me a sense of control. But at the same time, I couldn't actually write about it as though it were happening to me. It was too surreal. It was too absurd. So I basically did what Vonnegut did in Slaughterhouse-Five when he created Billy Pilgrim, his sci-fi alter ego. I created Keldar, my sci-fi alter ego. He handled prison way better than yours truly. But that was a way for me to actually I could go a lot deeper and darker into my prison experience and what led to that, because I felt like I'm not writing about me. I'm writing about Keldar. And so I could separate myself from that. And so then I'd say the third thing that really sort of, helped me in my healing journey, while I was in prison, and events that sort of, moved me towards that, was to find other people. Like when you can't help yourself, find someone you can. And so the best example of that would be this kid named Zachary. And one day in chapel, we'd heard that somebody, this preacher, outside preacher, came in. He said, somebody in your prison, in your facility, is in grave physical and spiritual danger. Now, none of us knew who it could be, but this young friend of mine said, "Oh, maybe it's Zachary." We both met Zachary, and we didn't know if he had anything going on physically, but spiritually, he seemed to be in darkness. And so I found Zachary the next day, and this was true. I was taking a biblical counseling class, so and one of our assignments was to do like a mock interview with a fellow inmate and just pretend I'm the therapist and just asking them questions. So as I was going through this list of questions, he told me that his mom left when he was 6 years old, didn't come back till he was 16. So here's a kid, even though he's not adopted, with huge abandonment issues, just like I have as an adoptee. And so I happen to have brought my poetry books with me to prison. And so I loaned him my first poetry book. And a few days later, I ran into him again, and he'd highlighted a dozen or more of the poems that really resonated for him. And so, I was able to, make him a copy of those. And then when I left, give him that. But also, I inspired him because I had this subsequent incident where I had volunteered in the Native American garden. And then because I had changed my religion to do that, I got suspended and removed from the Christian School of Ministry, and he was sitting next to me in chapel when that happened. And so I showed it to him, and then I looked at the bulletin and it said, "Oh, they're having baptisms next week." So I said, "Okay, this is absurd. They're telling me I'm no longer a Christian. Well, I guess I'll have to get rebaptized." And he watched me do that. He saw me get baptized in a dumpster and refused to be bullied by this chaplain. And he started taking Christian School of Ministry classes. So my hope is with Zachary that because I was able to plant a seed, I was able to show him that you can believe in God, but it doesn't mean you have to do whatever religious people tell you to do. That the two things can coexist. That hopefully he's found others now, since I left to be that example. And then the last thing I'll mention, um, I made a few friends because most of the time I was reading and writing, but maybe 20 or 30 guys I got to know fairly well during my time. And then I was I was either asked or I offered to share my spiritual journey in chapel. And so I invited, these 20 or 30 guys, none of whom ever went to chapel. And they all basically said the same thing. Oh, there's a bunch of hypocrites in there. And I said, well, yeah, my co-defendant, exhibit A. But I said, I just basically believe that God says, hang with me and be real. And so would you guys be willing to come hear me share? They all showed up. And so I feel like, just like with Zachary, I was able to share my vulnerability with these fellow inmates, just like I had with Zachary, and hopefully, inspire them that, no matter how bad, whatever it is they're going through, that there can still be hope. We can still find a light in some of the darkest places, like prison.
That's beautiful. Your wife's illness added heartache in the book. How did juggling that with legal battles and incarceration test the limits of human endurance?
Yeah, that was basically my breaking point. I mean, everyone has one. And so I had fought my case for about 3 years and my wife's an empath. So the stress of my case eventually brought her breast cancer back. She'd had it and we'd been doing everything right for 7 years. So at which point it's kind of like, oh, she should be okay. But it was the uncontrollable factor of the stress of my case coupled with her being an empath that brought it back. And so at that point, I quit fighting. I, took a plea, gave up my law license. But it was just, again, to see, just like we're seeing now, this brutality, this inhumanity, to see that the prosecutor, when she learned of this, and I begged for more time, my wife's surgery was on a Monday, and I, begged for more time. It's called a drop dead date. That was set for the very next day, that Tuesday. So I was in no emotional state to respond. And so all the prosecutor was willing to give me was 2 more days. Now, what the surgeon, my wife's surgeon, when she came out after the surgery, told me, which I never shared with my wife until after, was that her lymph nodes did not look good at all. So that whole week, I was fearing the worst, that, God forbid it is metastasized and I may lose her. So clearly, I was in no emotional state to respond to the plea. Thank God the judge had enough of a heart to grant us a couple of months. So, it's sort of each step of the way, I think, in the terms of how to be there for my wife and also fight my case and just whenever I was in a situation where I just could not, you know, go any further, there were angels. And that's something that sort of became this sort of through line for the book in actually in many ways was I was asked right after I caught my case, a number of friends had started a legal defense fund for me, and we had a little gathering. And even though I used to be a lawyer, I'm terrified of public speaking. So I thought, oh, I'm not going to have to say anything. My friends organized it; they'll do all the talking. And then at the last minute, they said, "Oh, why don't you come say a few words?" So I go up to the front, and I said to this group of friends, I said, "When I'm in hell, I have to call it hell." But I said the flip side is when I'm in hell, I appreciate the angels so much more. And you right here are a room full of those angels. And so what I strove to do in my book was, it's so easy to identify the villains, Joseph, my adoptive mom. Again, in her case, I understand her the best of the three key villains because she was abused herself. Joseph, I really don't understand. The prosecutor, I really don't understand. But with the three of them, I just felt like, okay, I don't need to lean into what role that each of them played in my life. I can simply say, well, this is what this person did and leave it at that. But with the angel, those are the ones I felt like, oh my God, these people need a spotlight. Anybody who can, like my lawyer, 100 grand or more, is what he would ordinarily have charged. But as his first innocent client, 20 grand is what he ended up. That's all I had to pay. And he lost so much money on my case. But that's what an angel this guy is. And I had a nurse who, when the guards were really cynical, the prison nurse was the first person to treat me like a human being. And they ended up getting rid of her because she cared too much. There was an inmate who died, and she was too honest in her feelings, and they said, "Oh, we got to get rid of her." And so, that's a tragedy. Sometimes the angels are the first ones to be let go because in these inhumane institutions, they don't want people that care too much. They just want people to just do their job, be a good robot. And, it's the humans that, like I say, are able to inspire the rest of us to hold on to our humanity as best they can. And so I do try to shine a spotlight on those angels throughout my book.
Most definitely. Does Killing Justice argue that the system is rigged against average citizens without extraordinary means? And what reforms would you demand for immigration and criminal justice?
Well, it comes down to, and I saw this definition that just like shocked me right before I was going to give that talk to those USC law students, and it was retribution, which is what our system is, eye for an eye, very Old Testament. But it is punishment that is legally justified. No, it's legal, but also morally justified. And I thought, really, what happened to me was not just legal, but moral? That's a stretch. And so there's a film called Beyond Right and Wrong, Stories of Justice. I don't remember the full title, but it's about different conflict zones. Ireland, which is where my own personal family trauma comes from, Israel, Palestine, and also Rwanda. And in each of those situations, those conflicts, you have people on both sides that are able to come to see one another as fully human. And that models something called restorative justice, which is what this country desperately needs. Because if I'd caught my case in Germany, in Canada, where I grew up, I would still be a lawyer today. But because, America, which prides itself on being the shining city on the hill, we have more prisoners, than anywhere else. So we are the largest prison state of the allegedly free. We need serious systemic reform. We need to move towards a model of more restorative justice because the retributive so-called justice is anything but.
For sure. How has reliving these events through the book changed your view of identity transcending the sum of our mistakes?
That basically, if any of us were judged by our worst mistake, we'd all get the death penalty. And so it's not about dwelling on, like regretting whatever mistakes we may have made, but rather trying to see, well, what lessons were there? Like blind spots did I have? Which, again, I joke is why it took me 10 years to write the book. Ethan Hawke refers to his character in The Lowdown as a passionate idealist with a ton of blind spots. And that's me. And so it's like rather than saying, "Oh my God, my life is over. I've gone to prison." It's like, "Oh my God, my old life may be over, but my soul, which was dying in my old life, but I couldn't see it because I was working with a guy whose soul was pretty much dead. And we see the world as we are, not as it is. And so I feel like the shift that I've made is now I'm beginning to see the world as it is, with all the paradoxes and contradictions that entails, and that, we are all good and evil, that the illusion, which is how I open my talk to these law students, that as Solzhenitsyn once wrote, wouldn't it be great if there were actually evil people in the world and we could just put them on an island and the rest of us live happily ever after? But the truth is, the dividing line between good and evil is in each and every one of our own hearts. And who wants to cut off a piece of their own heart? And so it's that heart surgery that's why I called my talk Heart Surgery for the Legal Profession. But that not only do we need systemically, we need it individually. We need to basically look inside our hearts and see, like, how much of my life am I living out of fear? And the more we can make that conscious, the more we can intentionally say, no, I am going to move towards love. Because where did fear get me? Federal prison. I thought I had to just follow all these rules and I'd be fine. But the truth is, no. And that's why I call the heroes of my life and art the principled rebels. Yes, we need rules, but at the same time, the law of love is the ultimate rule. And if man-made rules violate the law of love, they must be resisted.
We've got about 2 minutes left. I'm here with Kelly Giles, the author of Killing Justice. Could you tell people where they could reach out to you if they wanted to reach you for speaking engagements or
Sure.
interview you?
Absolutely. Thanks. Yeah, just go to my author website, which is www. Kelly Giles, my name, KELLYGILES.com. And then Instagram, my Instagram profile is K at Kelly, A is in apple, B is in barbecue, 303. I post, daily on Instagram, and then less frequently on my author site. But that's where, if, specifically my author site, there's a couple different places. One where I have a newsletter, so you can sign up there for updates, as because I'm also, oh, we didn't mention this. We're currently in the process of adapting Killing Justice for the screen. The gentleman you see behind me is my collaborator on that project. He's offered to co-write the screenplay with me.
Most definitely. What's his name?
His name is Bernard Gray, so find and follow him on Instagram as well. He's an award-winning Canadian filmmaker, and yeah,
Most definitely, man. I look forward to seeing it on screen. It's a privilege to read the book first. I love watching films, and I know you do as well. I've seen you out at a lot of the film independent events. I think the last one was Joel Edgerton's The Plague, and
yep, hopefully, yep.
yeah, yeah. So I look forward to seeing you more in the future, and thank you so much for taking the time. And I love to do more interviews with you in the future.
Appreciate it. Yeah, his last thought, bullying, belonging, and bawling like a baby are three of the themes in Killing Justice, but it's also darkly comic. So it's got a combination of all of those things.
Most definitely.